Off we go.
All right. Hello, Angus. Good afternoon.
Hi, Jeff. Good to see you.
Good to see you. We miss Kate.
Yeah, shame she
Kate.
couldn't make it today.
Yeah, we're thinking about you, buddy. Okay.
But she'll be back next time, Amanda, in case you're worrying.
I hope so. Yes, Amanda. Kate will be back.
Back with the old gits again.
Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, so we're going to start toward the beginning, which is sometimes a good place to start. But we were going to start at the end. But I found this little snippet here to be, in typical Zak Stein fashion, a super. And there we go. I can't see us. Maybe you're trying to bring it up. Now there is a delay in what I see. I wonder if there'll be a delay in what I hear. But anyway, Zak sort of introduces again the scope of the problem. So what they're going to be dealing with here is the problem of psychology itself, in the way it's manifested since its inception, and particularly in the middle part of the 20th century, say, or even before that. Actually, he gets to that in another slide. So I think we should get right to it and let him be our introduction.
Yeah, I just want to add, we're missing out a lot of stuff that Gregg talks about the history here, which is really, really interesting for people that are interested in the topic. But it's going to be a central theme of the whole of today. So, yeah, just encourage people to go and watch it if
yes,
they're really interested.
Yeah, for sure. And all of these videos are well worth the time.
Yeah. Okay, I'll press play.
All right.
Yeah, I mean, this is very, very interesting, and I'm agreeing with everything that's being said here. You know, metapsychology, I like to say, is where metaphysics and psychology meet. You know, and in the upper reaches of almost any discipline, you get the meta discipline. You know, you can imagine a meta biology. And but what's interesting about psychology is that you're circumscribing the limits of what psychology can be, and the kinds of questions that psychology is allowed to ask. So you're looking at what are the conditions for the possibility of doing a psychological science. And what's interesting is, and back to Piaget, Piaget identified the thing that psychology is working on is what he called a normative fact. So like 2 + 2 is 4.
Yep.
This is an example of a common psychological operation.
Yep.
Right. What's interesting about 2 + 2 is 4 is that it's not a causal fact. But a causal fact is like, if I hit this ball with this velocity, it will hit this other ball, and that ball will go in the pocket, right? It's a causal fact. A normative fact is different. It occurs not because of causal necessity, but because of a normative entailment.
Yep.
You say 2 + 2 is 4, not because you're caused to, but because it's correct. And so that's a very interesting phenomenon with which Piaget believed put psychology in a distinctly different stratum of scientific activity, where some of the disenchantment and reductionism that came along with the scientific paradigm in the natural sciences had to be limited, basically.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of like, to get to this point about when we're doing psychology, we have to traffic in the normative, and we actually have to expand scientific metaphysics to include value and entailment and a few other basically facts about the mind.
Totally.
And so, yeah, psychology is interesting in that respect, that it challenges the assumed scientific metaphysics of a kind of Humean reductionist world. And so if you look for a comprehensive metaphysics that can handle both psychology and biology and physics, then you look for something like this complex, dynamical systems view of life, as it were,
Totally.
which is a lot where your metapsychology, as all do, Gregg, expand out beyond psychology to include these conversations about big history and the full stack of the, matter, life, mind, culture, that continuum.
Totally.
And so yeah, I think it's foundational. And then in metapsychology, you're concerned with things like the realism of our psychological constructs, right? Which is to say, do they exist, or are they basically forms of folk psychology that have been reified through statistical technique, like, for example, grit. Grit doesn't exist in the mind the way, for example, a cognition, like.
Okay, I'll just zoom that to the background. You've gone silent again, Jeff.
Because I used the mute button this time. We were having some audio problems.
Yeah.
Boy, there's a lot there, isn't there? A science of metaphysics, an approach to psychology that would include biology and metaphysics and the psyche, the phenomena of the psyche. It's interesting because my first impression when re-listening to this is, again, this is anthroposophy. This is what Steiner brought. He warned about the notion in physics of the conservation of energy because it's not true, and so that's
creation out of nothing. You're referring to this central idea, spiritual idea.
Well, that conservation of energy in physics is that energy is a constant, and that we don't create new energy.
Exactly. So you can't have nothing. You can't have something coming out of nothing. It's only a transformation of from one energy state into another energy state, whereas spirit, integral to the concept of spirit is creation out of nothing, and in that sense, it completely defies this pillar. So, and it's important to stress that this. What we're saying is, if you exclude the spirit, then that appears to be true. But once you take the spirit into consideration, you realize it's what you were trying to say, a complete misunderstanding of the nature of the whole of life rather than just the material side.
Yeah. And so Zak is saying nothing less than what Rudolf Steiner has said demonstrated in his work. Now, you could agree or disagree with some of the conclusions Rudolf Steiner drew, but he did.
How many I didn't actually hear that coming out of Zak's mouth. So help me follow your thinking there. I'm not saying I disagree. I just didn't hear it come out of his mouth.
He said that psychology has to include physics, biology, and metaphysics.
Okay, right.
Mm-hmm. So it had to be a sort of so-called hard science, but it also had to be a phenomenological science of soul phenomena, and it had to include something of the way things originate, say something like that. It had to leave the door open for broader ontological realms than just matter and just what's the empirical rational bipedal machine. That is so prevalent and dominant, and so he lays the table for what a metapsychology would be. And again, this is I used conservation of energy for physics, but Rudolf Steiner talks about all sorts of phenomena from that say discipline. He makes in Riddles of Philosophy, he talks about Einstein and the result of the theory of relativity, for example. He has his work is hugely dependent on a physiology, and he has a book called Occult Physiology.
I was listening to that this morning.
Really, that's awesome. Yeah. And so I just offer that, and then of course everything is a symptom of the spirit with Rudolf Steiner. It's not you start. That's where you start.
Yeah. Because even perverse as it sounds to a materialist mind, matter is a manifestation of the spirit from this perspective. This is what a materialist just will fail to get his or her head around. This is a polar opposite relationship to what reality is. There's one thing that's also striking me listening to Zak and the whole flavor of this conversation, of these two conversations that we've listened to so far. I was reminded of I would have to look up where I read this, but Steiner is crystal clear in saying that in the future we will be as unconfused about psychology as we are unconfused about mathematics. And this is the dream these guys are looking for. And he's saying where that it's yet to come, but it's in the future. But of course, let's assume that Stein is actually not making things up there, that he's really talking sense. So if he is really genuine about, there will be the same level of clarity of thinking around psychological phenomena as there is about like how we do like the various mathematical operations. He would seem to be operating from a completely different paradigm. And we'll probably come back to this several times today, but essentially that if psychology doesn't have a concept of, and what in anthroposophy is called the astral body, and then it's like the intermediate body of the etheric body, then my understanding of Steiner's take on psychology is, no, you're never going to get clarity because you're not even seeing the soul's reality. You're just seeing these dead pictures and you're not able to study them. Because one of the reasons that the scientific process has been so successful in understanding the material processes in the world is because we can observe them. That we're not we separate ourselves out from them. We can study them and we can bring conceptual clarity to them. If we can't step outside of ourselves and see how this astral how the etheric body and the astral body are affected by the eye, then that clarity will never be forthcoming. That's my best understanding of the position that Stein is coming from. But I also understand why that type of position would be difficult to understand. I'm not even saying I understand it, but what I do is I don't dismiss it because of the level of clarity that it does bring to certain psychological phenomena that a materialist model is completely incapable of explaining in a rational, in a sound theoretical manner. And that's what we're going to be talking more about
for sure.
Today,
for sure. Yeah, definitely. The theoretical part is super key in relationship to the scientific process, and you get the feeling that that even I confided in you previously that I was a little bit skeptical about theories because I sort of conflated theories and models, right? And they're not the same. Models are sort of a pragmatic thing that people, generally speaking, that people work out of, operate out of, because it's a practical way to predict reality and to explain reality, say, but they soon forget that they're using a model, and sometimes that happens with theories. But theories are indispensable, and we'll get to that. That's really outstanding that you brought that in. Well, I think it's just an excellent introduction. This could be the introduction to the whole series, as far as I was concerned. In this little compact, it just opens the doors for what a metapsychology is. And then this when he says, I'll just say this and finish my thoughts on this. When we try to circumscribe science and leave out circumscribe a science that is psychology and leave out everything that is so-called unscientific because it's not weighable and measurable and coarsely empirically observable. They bring Sri Aurobindo in later, and how adjacent Sri Aurobindo and Rudolf Steiner are is increasingly remarkable to me. And they could have easily used Rudolf Steiner's work for a more modern conception of something that uses the same method, the natural scientific method. It doesn't use the same. It doesn't depend on instrumentalism, but nonetheless.
I haven't had much contact with Sri Aurobindo's work. The little I have seen of it, I've been deeply impressed by it. So I'm looking forward to hearing what Zak has to say about it. There is one other thing that I'd like to bring up, which has I've thought about a couple of times. Is I was looking at the difference between Piaget and Vygotsky. Now, Piaget is very much, he's a developmental psychologist that's very much focused on the on individual capacity, so like individual growth. And you might be able to tell me whether this happens at a later stage, but I am somewhat surprised that we haven't heard the name Vygotsky yet. So as another hugely important voice in developmental psychology, and particularly for the reason that he is talking about transformation in a social context, as opposed to just an individual. So, I mean, I'll find out if Zak brings that up, but I just wanted to make that observation that I've heard Piaget's name mentioned lots of times. I haven't heard Vygotsky's name mentioned once, and to me that is already indicative of a lack, perhaps a lack of balance in or let's say there are other ways of looking at transformation which already exist within the developmental field, which might actually be useful to this debate. But you might know something about that already.
Well, yeah, Vygotsky. How do you say it again?
Vygotsky.
Vygotsky does come in, but he doesn't play a central role. And I would add that neither does Freud or Jung, oddly enough. So the whole German school is sort of left out of this history. In fact, when we go up to a couple of clips up, and Zak talks about James Mark Baldwin, you can see why they're focusing on American psychology, particularly in this video, because American psychology dominates the way psychology is meted out nowadays. And so it would be unlikely to hear from them about Vygotsky here, or Freud or Jung, except when they're talking about the history. And then you would think that Vygotsky should be brought in, as well as von Hartmann and Brentano and Schopenhauer and their influence on the notion of the unconscious, which was a maybe taken for granted at some point. I'm not sure, but the way it's seeped into evolutionary biology is alarming to me, because it's assumed that well, we've talked about it before, but it's assumed that this dark long history out of which we have just an epiphenomena lives in our souls, inaccessible as unchecked animalistic desires and such. And so the other thing I wanted to say is I was listening to this fellow Paul Bloom, who speaks with Coleman Hughes on his podcast, and apparently Paul Bloom's a very popular psychologist who writes lots of books, and he's written one on the history of psychology basically recently, and he's an interesting and quite brilliant fellow. He's at Yale and University of Toronto, so so John Vervaeke,
friends with John.
I don't think they're friends.
Okay.
Because though they both lean heavily on the linear neo-Darwinian notions, say, as opposed to the more expansive Darwinian notion that Steiner brings. They both lean heavily on it, and in this, at some point, just to provide an emblematic example of the way in which psychology in the States, particularly, is meted out, and apparently North America, is that he at one point says the brain is the mind is the brain. So they're talking at that point about AI and about whether whether sophisticated technologies could read the mind, kind of thing. So I moved to say that here that in our previous conversation we talked about what thinking's role is in all of this, and it's of course if you have, it's understandable that people have a very narrow picture of thinking, and I said at the time that thinking is the ground of being.
Mm-hmm.
And you said it's the ground of the knowledge of being. And I think it's actually the ground of being. And you sent that excerpt from the lecture that described the sort of the physics of meditation, in a way, you could say, sort of that there was that when a meditant is meditating, that there's an actual a reduction in warmth and a reduction in light in the place that the meditation was occurring, which is really a bizarre but intriguing notion of the way in which consciousness works.
Yeah. I mean, we probably won't do it today, but the whole question of what actually perception is, which is the book you talked about earlier, the lecture series, Occult Physiology, it's in there, and we won't develop it here, but it is really interesting in the context of, these people think that the mind creates thoughts, whereas obviously anthroposophy comes from a completely different perspective. It's you can see sort of like why it happens, but it's the brain is a mirror for the thinking process. So when a person, from our perspective, a person who says that that thinking is produced in the mind is as confused as a person who, looking in a mirror, says this is the cause of the picture. The picture that's in the mirror is caused by the mirror itself, and it's perfectly understandable why people would think that. But I think anybody that's intellectually honest, that doesn't come with materialist baggage, would say, well, actually, this other perspective is at least is logically consistent. Whether or not we believe it, that's a completely different matter. But it's not. There's nothing that says that one is more correct than the other until you get into spiritual science, and then it becomes obvious where it's like where agency is in this. But that's probably going a bit further than we need to go here.
It's helpful though.
Yeah. Shall I? You wanted to. So we're going to play another clip now of 3 minutes, which is Do you want to introduce that, or do you just want to talk about it afterwards?
Let's just roll right into it. I'm a little tired, so I'm not sure how well I can read my own notes, for that matter.
Okay, go for it.
Jive with folks' frames and references in history, or any questions about that? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say also, the late 19th century, at least in the United States, when you've got William James, Charles Sanders Peirce, James Mark Baldwin, and a few factors just thinking institutionally about what occurred with Baldwin leaving the chair of psychology, first chair of psychology at the first graduate institution, Johns Hopkins, him being replaced by Watson. Right?
Yes. Wonderful. Thank you.
You take out someone who had a broad, structuralist, comprehensive, metapsychological orientation towards psychology that was developmental and included very strongly this reasons versus causes, and it was the great grandfather, inspirer of Piaget, incredible psychologist, removed. And in his place, you put a reductionist who ends up basically working in advertising. And around that same time, you got the reification of psychological measurement as a field, specifically wedded to institutional bureaucratic power. And this is a thing that's often overlooked, which is that measurement in the physical sciences, especially with the metric system and the international organizations for the codification of measurement standards internationally, which Charles Sanders Peirce was involved in. He incidentally codified the length of the meter through wavelengths of light.
Oh, fuck yeah.
First,
I didn't know he did that. Yeah.
Anyway, but the point was that there was major advancements in metrology and the physical sciences, which allowed for a lot of the industrial and scientific revolution and gave us the hubris of thinking like, the Brooklyn Bridge and these other incredible feats. And then we make this thing called the IQ test. The Americans steal it from the French, and they industrial strength it, and they tie it to World War I, and they do a whole bunch of other things, which basically give us the illusion that we're measuring the mind the same way we're measuring physical realities when we're not even close, not even close. And when I mentioned about the mongrel concepts and the reification of folk psychological ideas through statistical technique, is just a continuation of that form of irrealist, metaphysically naive psychological theorizing backed by certain forms of naive measurement practice and statistics. And that became early, and it was institutionalized, and it was bureaucratically institutionalized, and it became the one place where the field of psychology was able to contribute to the war effort and to industrial psychology and a whole bunch of other places that gave the field itself a sense of we matter, where psychoanalysis is yeah, this is a little actually more complicated because you're kind of making people unhappy and making them leave their marriages and their jobs, and it's very expensive. And so the massive move towards reifying a certain form.
Okay.
I didn't catch the first part of that, but I picked it up at just after he mentions James Mark Baldwin and the American School of Psychology, and alluded to that before. It's interesting here that what is notable to me from this clip is the degree and the complexity of the way in which materialism has had a hand in the way psychology has developed. And he mentioned psychoanalysis, and I want to get back to that in a hot second. But the idea that that economic incentives through careerism and opportunities through the advertising industry, which really brings to mind Adam Curtis's documentarian work with the century of the self and hypernormalization, and speaking of normative and normality, and what is normative is manufactured in this case. And psychology has contributed to the manufacturing of false normative realities in that sort of the what does he say? What has been normalized as fact is a fiction that helps to weaponize psychology but certainly to some degree by default through the use of psychology in economic and not just by the people who gain the benefits economically or the institutions that have arisen in order to support the economics and had gain research dollars and that sort of thing from to survive. Even the institutions need the research dollars, but not even that. It's also the way in which they've manipulated consumer culture to give rise to desires that people don't really have, except they end up being able to manufacture desires through these notions of grit and then the next step is the way in which artificial intelligence has been used in the back end of social media structures to capture attention and create limbic hijack and addictive sort of cyborgs, right?
Yeah, understanding how addictive behavior is cultivated and strengthened has been an essential part of the design of these applications. The use of rewards and this type of thing is it's based on psychological insights.
Yeah, so-called insights, mongrel theories, really, and theories are a mongrel theory is going to be destructive as opposed to a theory that is reflecting reality, which is going to be creative. It's going to be exactly the opposite. And of course, it's going to be devolutionary when reductionism is applied to the science of what it is to be a human being. And in any case, in any science, it's reductionism is not enough ontological ground to examine the phenomena that you're dealing with. So the other thing here I just wanted to say, because he mentioned psychoanalysis, is that the German school here, he's talking about the history of psychology in America, and the German school is completely ignored here. I don't think the American psychological institutions could have arisen and be as powerful as they are without the mongrel theories coming out of Schopenhauer, Edward von Hartmann, and Franz Brentano, mostly in his compromise away from a phenomenology of the soul, say.
I'm going to come back to this addictive behavior and just untangle it a little bit, because these theories that they use to encourage people to doom scroll or to carry on playing a certain game, so based on different reward structures and this type of thing, and obviously trying to monetize this. These are real psychological effects. These people know what they're doing. The mongrel theory, or theoretical mongrel, is about not having a coherent overview of how that little bit of psychological truth about how you can manipulate people towards certain behavior. That is true. It's not. There's nothing. There are billions of people that are being guinea pigged to show that this is a psychological aspect of the human mind. Where it becomes mongrel theory is that it's how do you integrate this into a total theory of mind, or what the psyche is. I'm a little bit confused still as to, for them, is mind psyche, or is it something else? But perhaps they'll unpack that later, because obviously there's a huge difference between soul and spirit for anybody versed in anthroposophy, and yeah, perhaps I'll just hold fire on that to see if they develop this idea. But I think this is yet again another one of those areas where, if they aren't talking clearly in this conversation or in psychology institutions about the difference between body, soul, and spirit, wow, you're doomed to mongrel theory from our perspective, because that's the basics. This threefold nature of what we are as human beings is also at the heart of anthroposophy. And it's not just that it might sound trite to say this threefold, but this threefoldness is something that repeats itself time and time and time and time and time again. It's almost like you can't escape the number three. It's like in anthroposophy. Okay, we have other numbers, but three is pretty central there. It brings to mind Tesla as well, for some reason, because I think he had a deep fascination for 3 and 9 as being the square of 3. But that was a little aside. There was another thing that I thought was, you mentioned manufacturing consent. I think that is a really useful concept too. It's to keep in mind Chomsky's book, Manufacturing of Consent, and then you had Bernays, which I know we've talked about in one of our videos. It's one of the godfathers of getting people to do things that they wouldn't have done normally by manipulating their perception of what it actually is, or their thinking around a perception would be more accurate to describe it. And how, as I think it's Zak, but it might be John, says that basically they've created an industry. You invent a concept, you measure it, and you sell it. It's you can see why it's got so many supporters, because a lot of people have become very rich over this. Actually, even within my own family and myself also, I've done some psychometric testing. We're going back to like 15 years or so, but I trained to be a Berkman consultant, which is a form of psychometric testing, and they'll use all types of facts and figures to convince you that their product that they're selling is really top notch. I'm not saying whether it is or it isn't, but they are a perfect example of people want clarity about other people, and they're prepared to pay a lot of money, especially in organizations where you're recruiting people to take on like large responsibility. It's when you take on a new business manager or a CEO, that's a huge change for an organization potentially. So how are you actually going to measure whether this person, to what extent can you measure whether this person is going to be up to the job or not? Which are the metrics? And the total confusion in that area. So when a company comes along and says, we've got some answers, and as long as the results fall out better than average, then people will pay a lot of money for it. People pay a lot of money for it.
Yeah, it's as John says emphatically, that psychology has privileged innovation over integration, right? So and so what that means from Zak's point of view is that psychology has to take the spirit, the soul, and the physiology. Not only that, but also the social environment and physics. So not just physiology, but physics and the social environment, because it's all part of one unified stream, as we see when we can trace it from thinking as the spiritual representation in the human being of that which originates existence. That's what I mean by thinking as being the foundation of existence, because it's not just the foundation of knowledge of existence. It is that too. But it's a creative act, as we'll find out when we get to theory. There was something else.
Did you want to say more about Hartman and Brentano? You mentioned them briefly there.
Just that stream, that the American innovation machine. Oh, I do know what I wanted to say, but the American innovation machine couldn't exist without this notion of the unconscious, and even scientific psychologists today who are have empirical integrity, say, suggest that Freud was wrong about just about everything, except that there's underlying things in the human being that were mysterious themselves to human motive, say. But like that's a ubiquitous static thing and there's no changing it from a sort of neuropsychological perspective. What I wanted to say was about the innovation. About science in general, in the way it operates, as relates to innovation over integrity. The silos are, in medical science, for example, the silos within medical science as to how the brain works or how the mind works, what the relationship is of the brain to the mind, are as witness Ian McGilchrist's work. He's not saying the brain is the mind. He's just saying that that to understand the brain helps us to understand how the mind flows through it, or something along those lines. How the brain is a physiological manifestation of something of a higher order. Say that is very much human. I'm not sure if Ian has the ontology to accept, but this idea that innovation in medical science isn't the driving force in medical science is naive beyond belief. Like it's just as pernicious, or even more pernicious, probably more pernicious, because the outcome, the products that are produced are of much greater profit, have a much greater profit margin and profit incentive, and the companies that benefit from the research don't have to do the research themselves. They have public institutions who do it for them, right? So I mean, there's, it's spent, most of their money is spent on advertisement, not on research and development. That's true, and that's a fact. So that's medical science. You could say that people call this technology that we're operating right now and operating within and on, and it's operating on us in ways that we're coming to understand, a scientific outcome, but it's not. It's a technological outcome. The confusion of technocracy and technocratic manipulation is not the same as science. Until we have a good paradigmatic understanding of what science needs to be itself, then psychology's then psychology's the least of our worries in some sense. Yeah. No,
we're going to be looking a little bit when we get to Kuhn and paradigm shifts. We'll be looking at exactly what you're talking about in more depth. Just a little snippet. You took me back about 30 years in time, or no, perhaps even 40 years in time, because of course, when you or I were teenagers or younger, the reigning psychological paradigm was that you are born with a certain number of brain cells, and they are continually dying, and so like there's this inevitable sort of like doom and gloom. So there seems to be a lot of really sort of like sad people doing psychology, and they're doing a little bit like Freud. Freud obviously had sexual problems. So what he did is, rather than recognize them in himself and trying to cure himself, he sort of said that the whole of humanity is cursed with the same thing. I mean, it's the ultimate arrogance, isn't it, to say my problem is the world's problem. But there seem to be some interesting repetitions of this same essential negative pessimism. You were referring to the unconscious. I was talking about limited brain cells, and they're all dying off. Psychology seems to be afflicted by a lot of people with a very negative view of what it is to be a human being. But then again, that's what they say about students of psychology. They go there to understand themselves. That's not bad in itself. But I didn't really want to say anything specific with that. It was just an observation of what people say. But it means that if people who do have like their own like particular hang-ups then get into positions of power, like Watson, which we haven't gone into detail, but they talk a lot about in this video, it has huge ramifications for the study of the human being. It's like for decades, or we're actually talking about a century now, essentially.
Yeah. So you talk about, and Zak mentions normative fact, like if you don't have a relationship with the normative facts of the mind, then you don't believe that there's a science of the mind. So everything else is just some sort of pragmatic utility for whatever purpose happens to walk in the door and has the most money or the most influence.
What was it Steiner calls in the philosophy of transcendental illusionism or something like that? Yeah. We can never know the truth, so we're just going to make it up.
Yeah. And I think that Zak Stein refers to it as metaphysical naivete, like a stubbornness about, like a childish stubbornness about it. Of course, if you don't have a model of personal self-transformation and development, then how could you actually use the science to develop? Let alone create an educational system that's about development. Yeah. So why don't we have educational systems that are not about why don't we have them that are about development? Because we don't know what development is, right? I mean, we have Piaget, who's basically ignored, in this whole school of people from North America, who had the metapsychological package ready to go, and they got pushed out through professional jealousies and ambitions and and God knows what else, right? So
Yeah.
this is the thing with Watson, is that he was essentially like, it reminds me of Steiner's description of Ernst Haeckel in the way where Ernst Haeckel was unceremoniously replaced at his position, right? And he had his influence, the influence of these thinkers may have us not having this conversation if they would have prevailed, right? Except for that damn mongrel, the unconscious.
But I mean, this Harry guy, he's pretty powerful. He's a pretty strong opponent. So in a way, it was to be expected. We are living in a period of intense materialism, and so from that perspective, the anthroposophical perspective here, it's actually not surprising that it has turned out like this. It's tragic, absolutely, but it's actually not surprising, because it's the eye of the needle that we've all got to go through.
Yeah, right. That's for sure. And the manipulation of public opinion to keep that machine going has been one of the most profound engineering acts of humankind. The Brooklyn Bridge, nothing.
Yeah, exactly.
To the moon, nothing. Space travel, time travel, nothing compares to the absolute understanding that we are social beings and we want to conform to a reality. So, hey, why don't we just create a reality, and then we can manufacture the reality so that we can get people to conform to that which we would like to be, that we'd like to self-promote, say, right? And that's not
Zak actually talks also about that, doesn't he? Talks about these models for manufacturing consent. Who are the biggest customers? The government and the military, to control the people. And if they were controlling it in a healthy way, I think it might be more understandable. But it's that's quite clearly not the case.
There's just no way to control it in a more healthy way, right? So the control itself is the problem.
Yeah, that's right. Okay. Moving to the next one, I'm going to play a clip also from Zak in a minute, but I wanted to talk about the conversations that lead to it, because they're quite interesting as well. So Gregg, he talks quite a bit about actually psychology's intellectual dishonesty. They talk quite a bit about physics, that at least it's honest with its lack of ability to bring macro, micro, or quantum and macro theoretical conceptions of the world to unify them, but they don't hide that fact. And Gregg is pointing out that this is a huge problem here within psychology itself. They're not even being honest with themselves. I mean, I think psychologists would describe that as psychotic behavior, not being honest with yourself. John then goes on to he develops what Gregg is talking about, that how psychology people turn to psychology to understand themselves better. They want to use it as a tool to improve their lives, and this key word throughout these whole dialogues is to aid the transformation process. But because psychology is so fragmented, this is a word they use as quite often in the conversation, especially this second conversation. It's fragmented at a theoretical level. It means that, they come up with this wonderful line. I don't know if it's exactly here, but it's sort of these psychologists, they're messing everybody's minds up so that they've got customers. It's not exactly what he says, but mental health crisis that we are currently living through is driven by psychologists through their fragmented theoretical model of what the human psyche and spirit is. And it's certainly an interesting thesis. I wonder if there's some people who've done a few papers about that, because to me it seems like there would be a lot of mileage in investigating that. Whether you get published or not, that's a different matter.
You'd get fired, is what you would get.
Right. Anyway, so I'm going to play the clip from Zak. That's after those 2 bits by Gregg, and then we'll take it on from there. Hold on. So I need to fade it in, and I just need to. Yeah, we're good to go.
Create, which they don't understand, but psychology is some technology comes out that the physicists create, which they don't understand, but psychology is a language of self-description, a language of self-understanding. And so there's something very interesting about the tolerance we have in the culture for incoherence at the level of what is the person, right?
Totally.
At that level of disconnect between what's being scientifically stated is the nature of the human and what we're running on, the kind of like the last fumes in the gas tank of the pre-modern life world, which are almost completely degraded by the processes of disenchantment and scientization. Yes. And so the perpetual and increasing fragmentation in that domain, specifically in the humanities, is one of the most disturbing things I've seen as an educator. And now what's interesting is that some of the resistance we have is still, again, something else left in the gas tank from modernity of a resistance to religiosity. Because as soon as you start to articulate a comprehensive enough psychology, someone's like, dude, that sounded a lot like religion, Gregg.
Totally. It's like a religion.
But it's true, because you're like, hey, we are part of this evolutionary process. You left out something in your historical narrative, which was the Piagetian tradition.
Yes,
which is the Baldwinian tradition, which is actually was that sleeping dark horse, which has reemerged as the dynamical systems evolutionary view, right? Which ends up being a kind of religious sounding story. It's saying, what do you study when you're studying psychology? We're studying evolutionary patterns that are universal to all of life and matter, which manifest and make themselves explicit in the human mind, and then something new emerges through the human aspect of evolution.
Okay, so lots of interesting stuff going on there. I want to reflect on 2 parts. This resistance to religiosity and fragmentation, and this aspect of fragmentation. This is also one of the areas in which Stein is crystal clear about how a holistic, understanding of the human being in a cosmic context, in a truly universal context, is the only medicine that will stop this fragmentation process. And I don't mean here the fragmentation of psychology, I mean the fragmentation of the individual. If an individual isn't able to reconcile the various aspects of her life in some meaningful whole, then that ends up working destructively on that individual. I think one of the clearest. That's perhaps there's one part in the philosophy of freedom where I think Steiner says something really profound, which is related to this. And he talks about people who don't have confidence in thinking, understanding there are lots of problems in the world. But if I can't have faith in thinking being able to eventually finding a unity there, then ultimately I've lost that. I've lost that which could potentially save me. And this is obviously the essence of the of the philosophy of freedom. It's like recognizing what this thinking activity that lives through us actually is, and how it is this unifying aspect that brings a completeness to the whole human experience. And I'm going to this fragmentation is also not by chance, because the process of science, actually the word science, it comes originally from Latin, which means knowing, but actually if you go back etymologically, it comes from the word scare. The pronunciation is no idea, but it's a Sanskrit word, and guess what that word means? It means to cut up, which is exactly what the intellect does. It fragments the world, and we know from the philosophy of freedom the huge importance of this. But if you cut up the world and then don't find that by which you can put it together, then you become a fragmented, weakened individual. And just to drive this point home, so even further, the root of the word. So if we look at the root of the word devil, which is diabolos, which actually also creates this idea of it's like throwing apart, the sundering of something. So at the essence of Greek thinking, you have a cutting up of the world seen as a negative influence on life. And it wasn't just the Greeks that thought that as well, because also if you look at the Osiris, Horus, Seth myth, then what is it that Seth does to Osiris? Chop, 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 chop. The world falls apart. It's like the Greek Tiamat, I think it's called. No, I think that's the wrong word. I think that's from Babylonia. Anyway, their ideal world was that this pre-Zeth cutting up Osiris, holistic, complete picture of the human being in relationship to the cosmos. And how is that resolved? By Isis, collecting all of the pieces together, reunifying that which has been cut up. So this fragmentation is it runs so deep, and this is the other interesting thing that I'm trying to remember. Was it actually here? He said it. Didn't Zak say it earlier? He was saying there's this resistance. Was it in the clip you played? Resistance of finding coherence. So this is also a strange world that Zak describes. So we live in the past. If we go back a couple of hundred years ago, before intellectual thinking's really got going, people lived in a society where there was it doesn't matter whether you agree with it or not, but everybody lived in a context in which there was God and there was angels and there's me down here, I'm a sinner, but life had meaning. Okay, the meaning was to if you lived in Europe, it was to believe in Christ, and it's you'd be resurrected type of thing. Again, we don't need to even enter into the conversation as to what extent that was true or to what extent that was manipulation by the church or whatever. It doesn't. At a psychological level, what is important is how I experience myself in the world. And what Zak points out is psychology seems to as soon as it starts getting to some of these essential truths about the nature of the psyche and the spirit, he says, begins to sound a lot like religion. What did he say? Something, dude. What did he say there? Come on, dude. That sounds a lot like religion or something like that.
Yeah.
So he says, and there's this resistance. He describes how there is this resistance to actually reunifying the pieces, and that this is particularly perverse. That when we actually when they find psychological insights that sort of like seem to correlate strongly with like fundamental religious insights, and they were rejected just because they sound like religious insights. So this antagonism towards religiosity is a really interesting aspect that they bring up.
Yeah, I want to contribute to that because I was using Chat GPT, just messing around, sort of experimenting with it a little bit, but also it's helpful to get information.
Yeah, absolutely.
In some ways, so I was using it to get all of the cell membrane theories, say cell membrane, because I was in a conversation with somebody who claimed that a certain injection prevents cancer, a certain type of cancer. I won't go into that because of a virus, and I won't go into that either.
Slippery ground.
So I wanted to look into the cell membrane theory because the idea of infection turns on this notion of the cell membrane and how it's breached. And I'm not saying right, wrong, or indifferent, but this goes to the fragmentation bit. So I asked what are the theories, and it gave a handful of conventional theories. And I know that Gilbert Ling and Harold Hillman, I'm sorry, and Mei-Wan Ho all developed very strong scientific observation without instrumentation, without altering the actual living within the whole of the organism, within the context of the whole of the organism, not without instrument, of course. But in any case, they developed a whole different, not competing, but very covalent theories that agree with each other. And then you bring in Jerry Pollack, who's a biophysicist from Washington University or Washington State, and he develops this idea of the structured water, and it's also very similar to these other biologists, right? And so I asked, like, what about this? And they're like, so the Chat GPT says basically, those are theories that have created really interesting research, but they're not accepted by conventional science, basically, what the response was. And so I pressed that issue, like, well, okay, but so where we ended up was, because I said, but it don't these conventional scientific methods have an instrumentalist approach? In other words, there's instruments between them and the phenomena, and they in fact alter the phenomena, in most cases killing it in order to study it. So doesn't that take the study of microcellular biology out of the context out of which it lives? And well, it's very useful. Kind of basically that's all. And so then it finally got to this point where it brought up the MRI machine and what it measures. And my response was, well, so all of these theories that you're saying are conventional science have the cells as mechanisms that are isolated from each other, and they don't have any way to communicate with each other. There's not coherence. There's no coherence in this cellular organism, right? So what's up with that? Well, you're right. The MRI machine actually does depend on biological coherence in order to read what it is that it's reading. Right? So this idea that fragmentation is inevitable goes right down into the idea of what our very physiological makeup is about, what it is. And then we get the medical technologies and medical interventions, and we become extraordinarily dependent on external sources increasingly to tell us what to think, right? About our own health, about our own psyche, there's always then an external magic bullet for fixing it, right? And so the psychotropic drug industry is a dumpster fire of innovation, just keeps producing stuff and repackaging that which it's produced before and reselling it. Does that have to do with coherence of what a human being is and how human beings can be treated with the integrity that these guys are calling for? It does not. So we have as Zak says, what we have here is a category error deep in the history and philosophy of science, right? And I would say it's a category error that started in 869 in Nicaea when the Catholic Church eliminated the spirit as a phenomenological, cognitive, operational reality within the human being, and we were left with a soul that we could not trust because we were all stained, and that was the version of the unconscious then.
Then we're going to be talking more about that, because the next clip I'm about to play ties in tightly with what you're saying there. So there's a clip by Zak, but Gregg, as a prologue or foreshadowing his Zak's talk, there's talk about the institutionalizing of a narrative that's not based in coherence, which is exactly the point that you're talking about. And John, he talks about there's this a worship of the method as opposed to like a serious confrontation with what are the theoretical underpinnings of a psychology? What do we assume to be true, and what are the basic components of developmental psychology in the context of transformation? And he says that he calls it a categorical worship of a method that privileges innovation over integration, which is what you were saying there. And he then talks a little bit about he talks about this jingle jangle problem, which is it's like confused speak about what's going on, that one concept can have two names, or two names can be used for one concept. And so the important takeaway from this conversation, because these are people who know a lot more about developmental psychology than we do, they're describing the real confusion that's in psychology, or the lack of coherence, this fragmentation that is there. And they're also trying to understand the historical background that it comes from. And then Zak brings up something which is highly relevant to this conversation. So I'm going to play his little clip, and then we'll talk about what he talks about.
I'm trying to say is the self-deceptive, self-destructive pattern isn't innocent. It is finding expression in the replication crisis in a profound way.
Yeah, and it's not unique to psychology. I mean,
no. I only know about psychology.
Right, but it's if you look at the philosophy of science, especially since Kuhn, right, you see paradigms protect themselves. Sciences protect themselves, especially bureaucratized, institutionalized science. I think medical science is an example of this. They have the jingle jangle problem too, and disincentives to create market niches for innovation, which are really repackaged prior invention. Same thing happens in psychological measures. So there's a similar issue in a lot of fields, which have them locked into basically bad habits. And then there's these heterodox voices on the outside. And then eventually things roll over, but usually it requires institutional change that's pretty significant for that to occur. So yeah, it's quite a vexing problem, I think, at this point.
Thank you, Zak. What I was trying to emphasize, maybe I didn't foreground it enough, is that compare how much of an integration problem physics is facing, because they will foreground, at least to some degree. I'm not saying physics is perfect. I'm not saying that. I'm just making a relative comparison here. But notice that integration is heavily being sought after, and theoretical integration is being sought after, because there is no duplicitous attempt to conceal the fact that there is a deep fragmentation within physics.
So they're pretty clear about the fragmentation part, aren't they? This is something that we're going. So let's dig into this, Kuhn, because I read this book 25 years ago. What's it called? The
Structure of Scientific Revolutions.
The Structure of Scientific Revolutions at 1962, and it's a key piece of work, because people have this idea that science is all about like trying to find it's like filling gaps in knowledge, and they slowly, consistently work to solve problems to increase our knowledge about the world. But what he says actually is, it's like, as a result of his findings, is that this idea that it's like these conversations happen, it's like purely on the basis of empirical evidence and logical argument, it's completely it is a non-starter if you begin to actually look at the history of the development of scientific theories, and we can talk about a couple of those afterwards if we like. And he's like, really, just like Kuhn really digs into this idea that they are driven by what he calls non-logical factors, such as personal beliefs, values, and social norms. So what people have this vision of the scientific method, and the method, it's like on paper sounds really good, but who are what is applying this method? It is human beings. It's like with their own beliefs, values, and social norms, which bring that to the fore. So rather than this picture of science like incrementally, like ever increasing its understanding of the world, what Kuhn maps out in his doctoral work is that science is doing its thing, and it has its assumptions, because every time when you're working within science, if you're writing a scientific paper, you talk about the assumptions that you're not going to question and the ones that you might be going to question in your paper. And this obviously saves the authors a lot of time, because you don't have to. Every scientific paper doesn't like repeat the model of the atom and all the assumptions that we make about the atoms. They're taken as given. They're no longer questioned, and the science is done on the basis of these assumptions. And the important thing to note there is that means that science is most often uncritical of the assumptions it makes whilst it's doing science. It has certain truths that it takes for given, and what this happens is that there's this belief bias in the system. There are certain things that we can't challenge, because so many so-called understandings of the world have been based on this, and we don't want to rock the boat by it's like fundamentally calling into questions like the nature of the atom. So we carry on with that model. But these assumptions, they're hugely necessary for the scientific process, because we do, if we were always going back to like first principles, we'd never get any work done. So we're creating, in Steiner world, you talk about creating a provisional self. It's like we're creating a provisional basis from which to understand reality, but which then grows with as it's gains more knowledge about what reality is. And this is where the scientific process falls down in a lot of aspects, because when new evidence comes along that should really be causing people to rethink the model, they'll blind, because they're not even aware of the assumptions they're making. They'll reject any new science that says that you need to be calling this into question. And especially if there are financial incentives to keep a model going because it's generating good profits. You've got some of these companies like making good money off this lousy science. There are a lot of financial incentives to not call into question the fundamental beliefs. But if we don't call into question our fundamental assumptions, both as individuals and within the scientific process, then it's extremely likely that we're going to find what we're looking for, so what's called confirmation bias. And this leads to a huge undermining of the whole scientific process. So this description that Kuhn makes of how science progresses, which is from 1962, as I said earlier, it feels like it gives us a theoretical understanding for exactly what John, Greg, and Zak here are describing. This is a model in crisis. It's fragmented, it's incoherent, it's in denial, it's psychotic, and all these other things. It's waiting for us some type of model to come along to help it overcome all of the fundamental contradictions that are within that model. Yet it doesn't find itself able to make this paradigm shift that is required so that things begin to fall into place again. So we can talk about, there are so many paradigm shifts that you could talk about. It's like in science. Let's just talk about one of them, which is the idea of plate tectonics and geology. Back in the 50s, I should have done a bit more homework on this. I can't remember the name of the guy who came up with this idea. But he was ridiculed by the scientists of the day. This was a rigorous scientist. Perhaps I'll do a little bit of background check whilst you when you're talking, Jeff. But so this guy really did his homework. He discovered how there was fossil remains that was in incongruous places. But if you understood how these plates, that he developed this theory for plate movement that allowed him to reconcile how fossils appearing in, let us say, Alaska, several ones were being found in I don't know, let's say what's off the somewhere on the other side of the Pacific there. And he developed this theory that said that, well, we all know what plate tectonics is. So he had buckets of evidence to demonstrate it, but what was the reaction of the scientific community at the time? Absolutely, he was ridiculed. I believe he went mad, like quite a few scientists have actually done, because his perfectly good science, his updating of the paradigm that people are working with, was not wanted by the people who held the old, less informed beliefs. And the challenge, of course, you and I, we're going to assume here that we've got a better model. That remains to be seen. But in Steiner, we do believe that. And I think this is where the fundamental challenge is going to be for people like Zak, John, and Greg. The paradigm shift has actually already happened, and people are working with these models, with this, it's like a new understanding of the human being's relationship to life and the universe. And in the context of transformation, one of a particularly interesting group of concepts is based around the around the idea of biography work, these different phases that we go through in life, and you've also got the developmental stages of Steiner, which coincide to a large extent with like general understandings of developmental psychology. But from the perspective I'm coming from, the paradigm shift has already happened. But these guys, I'm sure they're good, valid reasons, don't seem to be in a position where they would be able to take it on board. It could be because of the positions they hold in the institutions they work in, and fundamentally held beliefs. But I think an honest debate about what some of these fundamental concepts are, and how they are deeply rooted in the essential nature of the human being, psyche and spirit, it would be medicine towards resolving this fragmentation, to creating a unifying picture of what the human being is. Yes, that's it's quite a long bit, but Kuhn is really Thomas Kuhn, really important book that he wrote there, and it's really at the heart of what's going on in these first two dialogues that I've heard with these guys. They're struggling, they're recognizing the paradigm that psychology is working from is flawed, it's fragmented. They believe I think Gregg talks in the first one, wasn't he? Was it this one? He talks about five. He's got 5 concepts that he wants to make as key for being an accurate model for understanding transformation. Yeah, but he hasn't developed that yet. So we'll have to wait and see what he has to say there. But yeah, I said quite a lot. What your own thoughts about what Zak was saying there about Kuhn, or anything else related to that?
Well, the critique of Kuhn, of course, is that he was part of the paradigm that he somewhat did not recognize his own involvement in the paradigm that he was operating with, say, because he believed in absolute bias, for one thing. So the paradigms are based on values and that sort of thing. So there's a limit to the way Kuhn treated the problem, I would say, though he did draw attention to it in a very important way.
Go ahead, try and unpack those the ways in which he was limited, because I'm not aware of those.
Well, that at the foot of at the first principles are theoretical provisions that have to be accepted but not scientifically discovered themselves as first principles. So he said paradigms are problematic because you have to accept the inherent bias that's associated with them. And bias is a ubiquitous conditioning that I believe is not something we have to accept, right? If we're doing science, if we're doing spiritual science, because you're using the same method. So this is a good time to try to describe what spiritual science is and why theories are important, right? So those first principles are theoretical substrates of the whole paradigm, say, and the whole paradigm rests on those axiomatic presumptions, right? And not only is our science not interested in examining those presumptions, it is violently opposed to doing so, and gaslights and marginalizes through public relations, largely thanks to psychology, people who are questioning the presumptions at the heart of the paradigm. So if we're going to have a shift in a paradigm, that we actually have to shift the notion that paradigms need to be built on presumptive axiomatic structures somehow, because we can't know reality. So I would say that Kuhn accepted the materialistic paradigm to a certain degree in order to describe the way in which it's a paradigm among other paradigms, say. That's my claim.
I didn't. My reading of it is that it was a description of. So there's a description of how people perceive science to be done, and then the reality of how and how science develops. Even let's make it even more. How science grows, how science transforms, and people. The general. The way it's sold to the public is that like small, like incremental steps towards the truth, and he outlines how no, this is not how it happens, because we have human beings doing science that have their biases, they have their own values, which means that they can accept certain things as being true, and they can make certain assumptions, and then they'll refuse to make other assumptions, and that this is not science that's like based in empirical evidence and logical argumentation. This is based on flawed human beings with biases in their reasoning, which is the antithesis to science. That for me was that's the essence of what he's saying. Science as it's told to the public is not the science that's done. And what Gregg does at the beginning of this presentation is give yet another example of how that somebody with like a huge set of biases comes in and shapes a whole field of science for a generation, or arguably even more. So even though Kuhn might not have even mentioned like psychology as an area, but he could certainly use it as a case study in his.
So what I'm getting at is the whole modern natural scientific conception is a paradigm that is doomed to go wrong, because it does not have the ontological structure associated with reality. So it makes up reality and then measures it. Like psychology is merely emblematic of that. It is riddled, except maybe in physics, where, as they were talking about, they're actually having dialogue at the paradigmatic level of what physics is about, and how could it really reflect reality. And their problems aren't as defined as Vervaeke talks about. But to you take medical science, for example, it's built on a materialistic paradigm. It's built on the paradigm of materialism, which is a paradigm in and of itself. It's inevitable that the people within the rat cage are going to keep responding in a Pavlovian kind of way to the stimulus around them, because it itself is designed to be that way. It's designed. Materialism itself fragments, because that's what happens when you think the mind is the brain and the brain is the mind. You only get fragmentation, and then you get conflict and silos, and so that's why Zak says here that he doesn't think the change is going to come from inside psychology. There's just no way it's going to happen. It's institutionally corrupt at the level of theory and ontology. So there's a deep category era in the philosophy of error, in the philosophy of science itself. That's what I'm trying to say. And I don't believe Kuhn addressed that significantly enough. That's all I'm trying to say about Kuhn. Rudolf Steiner addressed it in the Riddles of Philosophy and in all of his epistemological work, which are essentially history and a philosophy of science with an honest, non-presumptive, non-modeled, all first principled phenomenological approach to how we gain knowledge. And I'm saying that the materialistic paradigm doesn't have intellectual integrity at its beginning, because it doesn't know what thinking is. It's never examined it. It presumes thinking to be a outgassing and an epiphenomena that just emerged and consciousness that it rides on accidentally because of the way atoms are banging together over time. It's just that's what I'm talking about.
I do want to emphasize that but a materialistic understanding of the world does help us build Brooklyn bridges and far more impressive physical structures, but it has very little to add when it comes to understanding the psyche and the spirit.
Yeah. Yes, and it also builds AI that captures people's attention and exploits human beings and turns them into cyborgs. It builds. It has no. It has no normative fact at its basis, materialistic science, because it already has a notion of the nature of reality. So much so that materialistic science can't understand matter. So you don't even have a coherent description of matter if you don't have the spiritual out of which matter emerges. So the problem is deeper even than I think Zak is presenting, but it's way deeper than a paradigm within a paradigm within a paradigm in psychology or medical science, or it's all one hot mess of fragmentation. And it makes its utility is obvious, right? We can drive around in cars, we have comfort, we have got all sorts of great things, except we don't have a moral continuity as relates to consequentiality of what we're doing, because we don't have a unified understanding of the world and ourselves. We only have a fragmented one, and then we say that that's the only understanding that we can have, and then we use that to study people. It's ridiculous.
Okay, your next clip was Zak at 1:17. Did you want to do an intro, or shall I just run that for you? I think you might have just pressed mute, Jeff.
I did accidentally, yeah. Yeah, please just run it. I'm too tired to really remember what the clip is.
Okay.
Sorry, but I'm trying to get clear.
This is metapsychology, John.
Yeah. There's fragmentation, there's a category mistake, and then there's self-deceptive, self-destructive behavior. And what that does is it backgrounds and marginalizes, and I'm even thinking in Derrida's sense, it marginalizes the need for integration and does that actively by privileging innovation over integration. And that is a powerful factor driving the replication crisis. That's the argument I wanted to make there. That's how I wanted to get that out. Thank you, by the way, for patience. I think
it's a crucial point. And it says there's a deep problem that's self-perpetuating and creates a feedback and it's inoculated. But we can diagnose it by things like the replication crisis, affords us an opportunity to enable it.
Exactly. That's the argument I'm trying to make. Thank you, Greg. You articulated it further in a clarifying way. Thank you very much. That was helpful. How does that land for you, Zak? That argument I just made?
No, it makes perfect sense. The replication crisis is probably the most well-known place where this is just like, being reported on. Basically, people are being aware that there's a replication crisis, And I mean, I was thinking about how confusing it is if you are trying to make sense of who you are and your place in the universe, and you turn to the field of psychology. Then I was thinking that the mental health crisis could, at least in part, be driven by the psychologists working to try to stop it. And this is an example of an iatrogenic spiral, which I write about, which occurs in a lot of places where you keep doubling down on the same way of trying to solve this problem, but it's actually that problem-solving technique that's causing the problem. So we have reductive psychology, right? Psychological theorizing, confusing people about the nature of their identity, and then as they try to get help about their identity, they go to that very science that confuses it.
The primary.
Go for it.
Well, it's a good summary. I mean, we've really nailed this, I think, pretty good, you and I, throughout. So we in a way prefigure what he's saying here. And I thought John did a nice job of laying out the three problems. And again, I mean, what is there to say that hasn't been said? He's on our team. I'm telling you, Zachary Stein is on our team.
It's so profound what he's saying, isn't it? That psychology is. He's not. It would appear it's like in this age where psychologically we feel like we're a lot more enlightened than we were 100 years ago. We've got more. We seem to have more mental fragmentation, more mental ill health, more depression, more psychosis. It's like in so many areas of society, identity crises going on, and is to what extent has our so-called increased understanding of this actually perhaps even contributed to it? I mean, we could go back to what we talked about earlier, that this is government and military. It has actually been weaponized against people, and I could certainly. I'm not going to do it here, but there are certainly several recent cases where I could say absolutely they know exactly. There are certain forces in society that know exactly what they're doing with these psychological concepts that people on the whole are not aware of, and because they're not aware of them, they can be manipulated by them.
Yeah, and that's true. And they've learned a lot about how to manipulate, right, in order to create technologies that further manipulate better and better. But also, as Zach says, it's a deep category error in Western society. I would say it goes way back, and it's an impulse toward self-loathing and self-destruction that also drives it. So this iatrogenesis. So this is a notion that even Illich surfaced in the 1970s. And this is exactly when the whole medical industrial complex, which swallowed up psychology as a mongrel religion, say, itself, and that the Western program has sort of built in it some sort of self-sabotage, right? Largely because it has a fundamental denial of what the self is and what a human being is, what a person is. And this is the thing that Zach finishes with. I'm gonna have to we need to bring this to a close for me, because I've got to attend to a catering. So I really appreciate this. I'd like to revisit the last 2 minutes, or maybe we can finish with the last 2 minutes and skip the interim.
So where Vervaeke's talking.
Yeah, because we need to talk. We also need to talk about the Cambrian explosion and the whole big history thing.
Yeah.
So can we pick that up next time? Pick it up there.
Yeah. I'll press end record now. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.